Hi, welcome to episode 81 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we all live in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Seth Kaplan, who lives about 180 miles southwest of me in the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area. Seth is a leading expert on fragile states, lectures at Johns Hopkins University, consults for organizations like the World Bank and the U.S. State Department, and recently wrote a really amazing, provocative book called Fragile Neighborhoods about how we can repair American society one zip code at a time. So, Seth, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Great to be with you, Michael, and I will, but let me first ask you, where in Brooklyn are you?
I'm in Cobble Hill.
Cobble Hill, so it's a very
Yeah.
nice area. I spent 3 years living on Kings Highway,
Okay.
which is probably just a few miles from where you are now,
Yeah.
Flatbush area. So there you go.
I remember you referring to the Park Slope and I think like Prospect Lefferts Gardens or something like that. There was a.
Opposite side of the park. So
Yep.
I can't. I that wasn't my idea originally. It's in the book, but I know both neighborhoods, so I could
Mhm.
speak about it. And I lived a few stops past those places further into Brooklyn. Yeah. So
Okay.
so in answer to your question, so I'll say a few things. Um, I think I can say my life is like a series of episodes. So when I got out of college, if you want sort of a big picture story, I wanted to wander, and I had a backpack and went knew some people from some conferences, and I literally wandered Middle East, wandered in Africa, lived in Africa for some period of time, Eastern Europe or Central Europe as we call it now, and then wandered, ended up in Asia. So I had time in lots of countries. And the question that kept me up at night was, why do some states work better than others? And at some point, when I had to turn all this travel and I wanted to do something practical with it, the really key question that I thought was what mattered the most was when I'm going to all these countries and I'm looking at it, why is this country working better than that country? And for me, the thing that was always the most striking was the nature of the relationships, the nature of the social dynamics, and how that affected politics, how that affected economics. And yet, when I read book after book on countries, they're mostly up here speaking about, well, this is the politicians and this is the policy. And there's not a lot of deep thinking about what is going on down here and thinking about how this affects how society is really upstream from politics. So that's really been the lens that I use in all my work. If you read what I write about on fragile states, you'll see me with lots of books and lots of papers and actually practical work on the ground in countries about how do we strengthen relationships, strengthen institutions, supporting relationships. And so when I was asked 2015, 2016 here in Washington, people know me as the fragile states person. What is wrong with the U.S.? Are we becoming fragile? The journey I took into America, which is a little bit like your journey here on this podcast. I didn't go and interview people so formally. I wandered about and met a lot of people and read a lot. It was a question of what is going on in our society and how is that affecting everything else. And that really led me eventually to get to where this book takes us.
Mhm. Um, Now, one of my theories or thinking on this is I don't know. Like, I graduated from Penn in 1993, and when I came out of school, the whole world was kind of open up for the first time in generations, and it felt like my generation were some of the first in a while were able to kind of go to any country like you did, backpacking around, and I think like one of my like kind of macro theories on what's been happening is that our generation got somewhat we rightfully went out to explore the world to connect with all these other cultures and all these other countries, but and between that and then kind of the fuel to the fire was technology. But I think in doing that we kind of forgot about our own neighborhoods again because we were so enamored by all these other foreign cultures. So I mean, how much do you think that plays into what's been happening? And like maybe it's an understandable consequence, and now what we're doing now is reacting to that.
Well, I would say that I think it goes back further than that. And I don't think it necessarily means that you have to travel the world to become disconnected from your place.
Hmm.
I think what you see is starting somewhere in the 60s, the car itself, the change in how we shop, the change in how people think of careers, the nationalization of so many things in our society, the role of the federal government versus city and state governments in many decisions that matter to us. You can go on and on. I'll give you a very specific example. I am a baseball fan, and
Hmm.
I often listen to baseball classic games.
Hmm.
There's a way to listen to those. And one of the things that I find interesting about the game is the commercials. And one of the things you hear in the 50s and 60s is that they have every seems like every city has its favorite beer. Every game, every I listen to the Dodgers. They have this game. I mean, you're from New York. The
Yeah.
Rheingold beer
Yep.
was the popular beer for the New York Mets for I don't know 15, 20 years, and I had never heard of it before because somehow it was taken over or some big company bought it out or big company came in and crowded it out. So you went from every place having unique products and unique stores and unique flavor to everything being national. And we have efficiency gains. We got wealthier. We got more mobile, but we became less sticky with each other. We became less connected to where we are. And I think we see lots and lots of the downside. So I do believe what you see international, it's part of a larger trajectory of change. I mean, the fact that you can
Hmm.
get on the plane and travel so easily is part of the change, but I do believe there's a whole lot of other things going on at the same time that are making us less committed to each other and to place. And I don't think we have to be where we are, which is why I wrote the book.
Hmm. Is there, I remember you referring to like I guess like divorce rates going up and like both parents working, having to kind of like farm out like childcare and even like kind of assisted living programs, like all those developments which seem convenient. I don't know, are the ones that have been kind of subtly kind of undermining that sense of community and neighborhood. Is that right?
I mean, again, you could look at 100 individual choices,
Yeah.
and I think each of these choices they make sense when you look at them alone. And I'm not here to say that both parents should work. I'm certainly not here to say that. I'm not here to say that not everybody wants to be day in and day out with your crying, whatever, 1 year old
Yeah.
baby. And so I'm not here to tell anyone what's the best way for them to live. Everyone is different. Everyone has to make their own choices. And in a sense, each of these choices makes sense. It's the bundle, it's the
Mm.
combination. I live in a neighborhood where you often see multiple generations of families. I'm looking right across the street. There's a family, the Franco family, and there were at one point, I believe, four generations. His parents, the person across the street, his parents died in the last 5 years. They lived in the neighborhood. He grew up in the neighborhood. He has two kids living in the neighborhood, and they have kids. I mean, now it's not quite the same because the parents have passed away, but you have that, and so this is when you live in a close knit community with multiple generations and people that stay there for decades. The community, there's even a foundation for not a very small foundation that it must have been his parents started that are help people around holiday time when they don't have resources or something like that. So when you're in a place for a long time and you have family there for a long time, you have a sense of connection. I mean, there's people in this neighborhood that has known this man across the street for 30, 40, 50 years. And you could see them talking every week in and out of their house. And I've only been here for 11, 12 years. I don't have the same history here. But then you think about how most people live their lives. And each of the decisions you mentioned make sense on their own, except when
Right.
you bring them all together, there's no community. We're all alone. We have our apps. We're disconnected. I mean, it's even on a day to day basis. how much time do we spend talking to each other? You can say, now I'm busy, I don't have time right now. But if you say that over and over again, you end up all alone. As opposed to if you have a little bit of time and a little volunteer and a little bit of engagement, and it's just incremental, you have a completely different relationship and dynamic around you.
Hmm. So then I guess with the first question that comes in is maybe very selfish, but you know, part of this is about thinking about your neighborhood. So I'll say, I mean, since you have an idea of what Cobble Hill's like, what is your like what would your advice be to people in Cobble Hill and Brooklyn or however you're gonna frame it to kind of get back to, I guess, cultivating more of a sense of neighborhood?
I
Like
mean,
what
yeah, I don't know Cobble Hill. Cobble has a very good movie theater, if memory serves me
yes,
right. I think
yes,
I've been in
yeah.
that movie theater before, about a block or so from the subway.
Yep.
So, I mean, I could just think of Park Slope,
Yeah.
for example, which
Same
is
thing.
a good example of a very very robust neighborhood. There's loads of local businesses. There's loads of places for people to meet. There's loads of institutions convening, organizing, lobbying, or advocating. I mean, the density of institutions in a place will often tell you the strength of relationships, the strength of commitment to that place, the interaction between people. And so, if you're asking me, assuming Cobble Hill is part of the larger Park Slope, Brooklyn Heights, Park, whatever, if you consider that one area, or there are separate neighborhoods, a little bit different architecturally. But if you look at a good neighborhood, you have lots of those things going on. If you look at a neighborhood, the houses could be beautiful. I'm thinking a few minute drive from here, nice houses, nothing wrong with the properties, except what brings these people together. There's no local stores.
Mhm.
I don't know the details because I'm not there on a daily basis, but maybe there's no local schools. Maybe the kids are driving to school. There's no local places where people worship. Maybe they're driving or not worshiping. And you go step, and I mean, if there, and of course, in where we live, there's a county government which has, let's say, I don't know, 800,000, a million people under it, and there's no level of government beneath that. So if there's no civic association,
Okay.
and there's no school, and there's no place of worship, and there's no coffee shop, and there's no restaurant, and there's no local shops, I mean, what is bringing people together? The closest thing you might have is a dog park somewhere, except probably in this area, they're driving to a dog park. So my guess is you may know a neighbor or two. If you live in a cul-de-sac, you likely, if you have kids especially, they're out on the street, parents probably know each other. But you could live in this place, be there for 25 years. Everything looks great, and you never do more than smile at your neighbors. So, what kind of life is that? I mean, you could thrive because maybe you have a great network, but there are loads and loads of people that aren't like this network type,
Hmm.
and they will do better if they're in a place with lots of institutions, lots of places to meet people. I think that's the big change in our society, where we had lots of institutions in a place, and every place or most places had that. Everybody could participate. When you have a network society, you have a select group of people that do really well out of that. They went to the right school, they went to live in the right place. But a lot of us are marginalized or left out, or our place is disadvantaged, and we're more alone, and we're more vulnerable, and we're more angry, and we're more alienated as a
Yeah.
result.
And you know, and part of like what you're saying is that that lack of interaction with your neighbors is also what it can, and that it's in a small scale but also on a big scale, that's what feeds that your anger and frustration, because that neighbor who you don't know at all that makes some noise next door just becomes a source of noise versus an actual human being that that you understand. You don't There's no contextualization of that aggravation to your life. It's just one thing.
Yeah,
um
I'll say two things. First, when you interact with people in a place, in a neighborhood, you are practicing compromise. You're practicing building trust. You're practicing being in relationships. It's a whole. It's like it's a natural, organic, especially if there's associations or it could be informal, formal, in which you're doing things with other people. You're not just saying hello, you're actually participating. That's like a training ground that it's not a formal training ground, but it's a way for people to learn to work with others and learn how to be with others and learn how to talk with others. And that feeds into everything else. I
Yeah.
would say on a second level is when you're doing that, you feel that you have an ownership stake in your neighborhood. You have a sense of agency that I can make this place better. When you have none of that, and all you have is the TV or the smartphone, and you have what's going on in our society, you basically feel that you are passive, feel you have no stake. You feel that the economy, the society, the politics are being done to me.
Yeah.
And so you're not practicing, but you're not feeling a sense of empowerment. And what's the result? You're likely to be less happy, less satisfied, and you're also likely to be more angry, alienated, and have no avenue but national politics and national campaigns. And I feel we see that result in our politics on a regular basis,
Yeah.
and the results are not pretty.
Then that term nationalization is fascinating, and where I see how that impacts me is I feel like you then start seeing like my is it seems like with the nationalization of problems, you feel powerless. You feel like I have to elect some kind of savior to fix things because I can't do anything, and these problems are so momentous. And I mean, one of the things that I think is easy is to kind of like criticize other areas or point out the problems, but then forgetting about your own problems, and it's not doing the heavy lifting to just fix your own community and
I
maintain
mean,
it.
I think it's so true. I mean, if you look back in American history, I mean, I like to say that we've had two versions of civil society, and we need to create the third version. Version one of civil society is what you read in de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville talks comes to America in the 1830s, Democracy in America, and it talks about all the ad hoc, local, very, very local associations and organized activity. Not a lot of it may not be formally registered, but so many things are going on, and they're very different place to place. But everywhere you go, there's this enormous social activity. I mean, his argument is that associational life is the mother of all of all, like, it's the mother of, basically it's the mother of democracy in America. It works so well because the society itself is democratic and everyone is involved with things. You get later in the 19th century, you get urbanization, you get industrialization, you get mass migration. The landscape has changed enormously, and then you have the growth of lots and lots of what I would call translocal associations. So everywhere you go is still rich in associational life, but often it's a chapter in a more national organization. Think the veterans groups. Think of the farmers groups. Think
Rotary
of some of
Club.
the workers groups, the Rotary clubs. The largest of these, they all come from the late 19th century for the most part. There's a couple of exceptions, and the largest of these have 10, 15,000 different chapters. That's an incredible number of chapters. A large organization today might have 100 chapters. Just think of the scale difference. And that is from the late 19th century. It peaks in the 60s. And then we have a downward. I mean, Robert Bob Putnam writes a lot about that. And you see the upward and then you see the downward, as well as someone named Thetis Scopel wrote a great book on this particular problem. And and then you see the decay of civil society 2.0. And so for me, I'm waiting for Civil Society 3.0. In the 2.0, because we have real data on this, I think roughly one out of every 30 or so Americans had a leadership role at any particular time in one of the chapters of that association. Just think about that. You live on a block, you look at probably within 2 or 3 blocks of you, there is someone who's a leader in a local association. Just imagine that information. Today, we have nothing like that You could go blocks and blocks. You go into whole towns, and there's few, if any, people. The civil societies become very professional, very elite. Doesn't involve average people. Very distant, very transactional. It is not. So we need a new version of this that empowers Americans in a way that we used to be empowered.
Yeah. Well, another thing you talk about in your book is you allude to how your civic responsibility has to extend far beyond voting. And I think that that's one of the things that for me, I feel like you get these stickers and we celebrate voting. And I don't know if this is like, if there's something going on, like just incentives wise, where, politicians want us to celebrate voting, but then don't get involved otherwise. But I think that that's you're hitting a really important point, is which we that's the beginning, that's the bare minimum to helping your community, right? I mean, there's so much more.
I mean, I'm all for participation in politics, but
Yes,
actually, I don't think it's the most important thing we do
right.
to be involved in our society, to be a member of our great democracy, to be deeply involved in helping our country, participate in our society. In fact, voting, what do? You might vote once a year, twice a year. Some years you don't vote at all. And being involved in a local association, participating by volunteering, by being out there for your neighbors. I'm thinking of, I have a woman. I live at 910 on my street. My block is 2 blocks long.
Hmm.
And there's a woman at 903. Her kids are, I think, early 20s. She has some free time and she doesn't talk a lot. She's not very tall. I know she's active because she's always taking a bicycle or walking the neighborhood. But if you really pay close attention to this woman, that nobody would actually, no one sees her actually do anything in terms of a visible leadership role. But I watch her because she's down my street. I know every week she's visiting the people in my neighborhood who live alone. Now, that could be because her mother lives, I know, also in my neighborhood, maybe 3 blocks from her, and her mother has lived alone for some years. So, my guess is she started visiting her mother, and then she became aware of some other people living alone. And I know that she does this because I have a neighbor right next to me on the left side on this other street. And I know she goes there once a week, and I see her walking up and down, visiting other people. But she doesn't only do that. When we have a park cleanup, her name is basically, she's the one organizing it. When we have a volunteer activity for a local nonprofit, her name's on the bottom of it. And I don't even know most of the things she does, but at the very minimal, she's involved in organizing all this volunteer activity. Some of it she's doing herself, letting nobody know. And so she's like a symbol of what it means to be involved in your neighborhood, taking a leadership role, doing it in a quiet way, not expecting any recognition, but you are engaged with other people, you're helping other people. And I think what she does was much more the norm. Today, we worry about ourselves. Today, we worry about getting this dream of our big house and our big career. And we don't really think about other people. But this is not the way life is in most of the world. It's not the way life was in our own country just a few generations ago. And that's just her. I could talk about the organization. I'm on the board of some local organization. I'm very involved with another organization, and that would be the norm, that people are involved in 2 or 3 things. Usually, they focus on a couple. I know some people, they just show up for everything, mostly because they can participate in more of a smaller way. But whatever way you do it, this is the way life should be. That we all have a stake, and we're all trying to make our neighborhood better.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you moved into your neighborhood a while ago, and if I recall correctly, you yourself have had a change in your appreciation for the importance of where you live. Is that right?
Well, I have to say that, I mean, when I wrote this book, I did not think, I did not, it wasn't, version 1.0 wasn't very personal. Of course, we get to the point where the publisher reads your book and say, you need to personalize more. So then I began to write a lot more about my neighborhood. But I would say, even when I was looking for a place to live, I lived in New York. I actually lived in Brooklyn. I got married. I'm from Manhattan, so I'm not far from you. I lived in the moved outside the country for many years, came back and lived in the Bronx. So Brooklyn was a borough number three. I got two more to go sometime in this lifetime, and I'm not sure it's going to happen. But I lived in Brooklyn. I got married. My wife is in Brooklyn. We lived in the neighborhood that she was from, and then we decided we wanted to move out of the city. And I had other things. I was doing work in Washington, so we looked south. And I will tell you, we looked at five. We did research. We looked at five or six different neighborhoods. And I even went and spent a night or two nights in several neighborhoods, a couple in New Jersey, a couple by Philadelphia, and then one of my neighbors in Brooklyn. It's not as compact of a neighborhood as it is here because you're in a big city and the different streets more bleed into each other. But she said, you got to check out this neighborhood in Maryland. She knew she had a cousin or something here. So boom, we came down here. We liked it, came back a second time. Then we rented, and finally we bought a house. But the point was, so I had an appreciation that I wanted to be in a certain type of community, and where we would move was very much about what we felt about the place. I mean, I have to say, I've always been a very physical person. I've always felt the surroundings were very important. I did not have a framework. I did not think about it very systematically until I did my research. But in my own personal choices, I was always looking for the right environment to have, in my case, have a family, have kids. And I think that's not unusual for an American when you move, maybe because of the schools, maybe because of the local shopping, maybe because of the types of houses. You do look for a particular neighborhood. I don't think people think often enough about what about the neighbors? What about the local institutions? In my case, it was the people that drew me here, nothing else. There was other places that were very pretty, very nice. Here, the place is especially community oriented and open and welcoming. And we felt that, and I still feel that 12 years later.
Hmm. Okay. And I think, was there a religious component to the neighborhood?
Yes, I mean, in my case, because I need to live in a place based religious community,
Hmm.
all those five or six places we looked at, I mean, we had lots of choices. I could have looked at 25 choices, but there were places where they were going to have a synagogue and they're going to have some other institutions that might be good for us or used for us, like some local restaurants. So in this place, it is true, but I also lived in Brooklyn. Brooklyn had many more synagogues, had
Hmm.
many more religious institutions. I never felt it as warm, as welcoming. So that contributes, but it's not always true that you have that and you have this level of warmth. There's something about the culture of where I am that I
Right.
especially have liked from the beginning.
Right. Now, when we talk about institutions, is part of the problem also that at least my perception of like what happened like in the 60s and the 70s was a revolt against institutions, whether they were the religious or whether they were the government or like big business. Is that something that also has kind of maybe made people like made society somewhat reluctant to be parts of an organization or institution?
Well, I think, first of all, I do think um, there's something in our culture that's maybe latent at times and more active at times, is that we are anti-authority, we're anti-conformity, we're anti being held back. So there's certainly something in our culture we're more individualistic than most places I've been to. I think it's true for the English speaking world. It's true in the Western countries more than the non-Western. It's true in the English speaking world more than other Western countries, and it's most true in the United States. Having said that, if you go back to the 50s and 60s or early 60s, we were very place based. So I do believe there's something I mean, at least the way we perceive it is that people are very anti the conformity, they're anti the clothes, they're anti the fact that it excluded certain people. from certain, I don't know, you could say sexual orientations, could say
Race.
excluded people because of race. Of course, we have our awful racial history, and we had segregation and talk about women. So I understand all that, but I also believe we could have opened up. We could have enabled much more openness, and we still could have had strong place-based community. There's a lot of choices we've made in terms of how we develop the land, build suburbs, and in terms of how churches used to be very place-based, community oriented, and now they're not. How we focus on we don't think of schools, we don't think of libraries, we don't think of government, we don't think of all these institutions in our society, most of them non-government. We don't think of the role they play in incubating, strengthening relationships. So we made all of civil society, or most of society, very transactional, professional, completely forgetting the previous role it had in strengthening relationships. And you go one by one in terms of all the functions. So I do believe that there was a drive for that, and that could have been very good. It certainly opened up a lot of opportunity. It reduced discrimination in many ways, and so that could be fine. But it doesn't mean we had to build a society that was so disconnected, and in some ways also place inequality, spatial inequality, much worse today in some ways than it was before. We had segregation before, which was the ultimate in spatial inequality, but you didn't have as much concentration of poverty
Yeah.
60 years ago, for example. It's much worse now. We have class-based neighborhoods, we have politics-based neighborhoods, we have a lot of things like that that we did not have before.
Yeah, I had a friend, and he was an early guest on the show who'd been a lawyer in New York and moved back home to Wyoming, and he had said that in one respect, obviously living in Wyoming was largely like white. I mean, there wasn't a lot of racial diversity there, but and there was in New York. But he said, but the thing that was interesting is that like in the city, you have these schools that are all like you have private schools, and you have like the rich more with the rich and the poor more with the poor and the middle more with the middle. And he said at his like school where he was in Wyoming, it was basically the economic diversity was a lot more robust, even if the racial diversity wasn't there. And it seems to be that's a little bit of what you're referring to.
Yes, I mean, we still have segregated or extensively segregated neighborhoods in the United States.
Yeah.
I think so. I can't say that problem has gone away. If you look at the data, it's gradually declined,
Mhm.
but you can still go to parts of America, some of the poorest neighborhoods, and they're significantly black, or in some cases, black Hispanic, and so I cannot say this problem is gone away,
Mhm.
but the class basis,
Mhm.
the number of distressed high poverty neighborhoods, much higher than previously. Gated communities with very wealthy,
Mhm.
even ungated, simply really expensive houses and properties in some neighborhoods. We had nothing like that either. We had bits of that, but nothing on the scale that we have. And of course, if you look at a map, it's hard to miss the political divides based upon where you live. I
Yeah.
mean, I can go to places that 90% of the people vote for one party or another party. That sounds like North Korea to me,
Yeah. Yeah.
or the Soviet Union to me. That's the kind of, you should not, in a healthy democracy, you should not have such extremes in voting patterns based upon where you live. I would say that means that even if you have good neighborhood relationships, you could be never meeting somebody with a strongly different opinion than you. And that's certainly polarizing and also a recipe for groupthink. And it reduces our ability to compromise, trust each other, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, yeah. So, but, the one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading the book is you talk about like kind of strengthening neighborhoods, and is that there also becomes and let me know. But like, I felt like what you could end up happening, like, and you'll see this in like our neighborhood, is like, hey, we want to try to make this these piers an extension of the Brooklyn Bridge Park. So you want to do that, and you want to rally together, and you've got a strong enough neighborhood to maybe you can do that and get the political attention to get the funding for it. But when you
Yes.
do that, you're also taking away from other people. And like, while we, I guess in a very like a very like uh, clinical sense have every right to advocate on behalf of getting what we can, it also ends up taking away from somebody else who doesn't have that power. So what I'm thinking is, and it doesn't necessarily have to break down by race, but you're going to have neighborhoods that are stronger and neighborhoods that are weaker. And if a successful strong neighborhood is going to be able to get more of the resources and be able to protect themselves. So you'll have NIMBY because, oh, we don't want that in our neighborhood, and you're strong enough to be able to push things out. You'll also become strong enough to where you start, maybe you don't want outsiders coming in who may, disrupt the way things are. So what's I guess, how do you address those kind of issues if you
Well,
if you are successful?
I would say that those are good examples of what people organize themselves to do in their neighborhood. In my neighborhood, people organized. I can remember a very small example to change the traffic light. We have a center to our, we have like a very, very small shopping center, but it's across the road. And literally, people organized to change the traffic pattern, the light pattern. Or we're a little bit worried about security. So we had a few people organized to sort of be on top of the security in our neighborhood and be connected to the local police. So I can find lots of these small initiatives. Most of them I probably don't even know about. Some of them times I stumble upon them or I hear about them, and I could give lots of these examples. But I would say there's a balance here. We just have to think of a balance of a neighborhood. You want to give the neighbors power. You want to encourage them to work together to come up with, or to encourage them to organize, often self-organize, to improve their neighborhood. In a proper city government, a city government should be empowering people in neighborhood to make decisions over the future of their neighborhood. And there's examples like in Seattle of that. On the other hand, you have this broader society interest that may not always may not always correspond to the interest of a neighborhood. So sometimes there might need to be, this is always the question: how do you empower neighborhoods in a way that they don't exclude people? For example, a neighbor doesn't want someone to move in. What gives them the right to do that? You have it in New York with the co-op system. The co-op system allows self-management of buildings, but you could argue that sometimes it excludes people that they may not like. And so, is that a fair system? So, I think there's a balance here. I think you need some sort of minimal standard in terms of what is being done. If they're trying to protect the character of a place, well, that's great. But what happens if there's a larger need for more housing? I think that's the most obvious tension you see in the United States right now is that people zone their neighborhoods to exclude people. Sometimes there's a indirectly there's a racial component. Sometimes it's simply to boost the prices of housing, but that is bad for other people. So I really think in the ideal scenario, you're giving neighborhoods autonomy, but you're also creating some sort of minimal standard. For example, if you can't dramatically change zoning, can you change zoning incrementally? So, for example, you can build an apartment on your lot. That would be like a compromise.
Right.
Maybe you can't build a 8-story house, but at least everyone can build an apartment on their lot. I mean, in my neighborhood, it's partly accidental from history. There is a center. I think it's 4 apartment buildings. There's townhouses on 2 sides of our neighborhood. So we have houses that are bigger and houses that are smaller. So we get a great diversity of housing units, and that's not normal in America right now. That should be more normal to at least boost the diversity of classes within a neighborhood.
Yeah. Yeah. Um. The I was thinking. Oh, one of the examples of like the resources, and I guess some people would say hoarding, others would just say a strong neighborhood is like, I guess like PTA fundraising, right? I mean that's to me the most glaring example of like a neighborhood that happens to have a lot of resources that can raise X amount of money, while the neighboring school next door doesn't have those economic resources, and they don't have nearly the resources. And I guess too that's I guess because we're just talking like actual objective numbers, but like in those kind of situations, have you seen solutions where a neighborhood feels like they're able to improve the situation for their kids in their community, but they're also, I don't know, are they sharing it with other schools, or like what's the way that if you are in a more comfortable position to be able to help your community while still helping others?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I mostly focus on. I mean, I can give the example in the book if you would like. There's an
Mm-hmm.
example of thread in my book in Baltimore,
Mm-hmm.
and so I think if you're thinking at the neighborhood level alone, you're mostly working to do things to improve a neighborhood. But then there's the relationships across neighborhoods that matter so much. So Thread is an organization in Baltimore, and it's basically Sarah Heminger, who was at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore for her PhD. Very smart woman, studies some aspect of the brain. I couldn't tell you the details, but she was very lonely, and she was school was great. All these kids came from very well off backgrounds and or strong family backgrounds, and there was something about it that was very isolating because everyone was doing their own thing. And she had some experience in high school where her husband, in particular, had a really bad experience. One of his parents went to jail. Another parent had problems with drugs, and he was going to drop out of high school in ninth grade. And he was lifted up by four teachers in his school that made an effort to make sure he had clean clothes and enough food and a space to study, and turned his life around. And she knew this story very well. And then when she was in Baltimore, was lonely, and she saw this school that she was passing by. Obviously, kids there did not have strong families, did not necessarily have food to eat. Some of them did not have a home to live in. Very difficult situation, but there was something about spending time with these people that made her feel not lonely, made her feel a part of a community. And so she started this organization to replicate what her husband had. Her husband helped her at the beginning, so they were sort of partners, but he's not involved right now, at least to my knowledge. And so this organization, on one level, is making a 10-year, 24/7 loving support. We will be with you at 3 a.m. in the morning. We will drive you to school. We will help you with homework. We will solve all these problems, and we will be there for you day in and day out, basically creating a family structure around the worst performing ninth graders, and now in many, many high schools in Baltimore. It's an incredible 24/7 unconditional love commitment for 10 years with these kids, hundreds of kids by now. And so, on one level, you are helping those kids, and by helping their households and helping those neighborhoods. But on another level, it's a much more equal relationship than may be obvious, because the people doing the helping, they have their own problems, they have their own needs. And it's not, she doesn't use the word mentor. She considers this a two-way street. At the beginning, maybe the ninth graders are more in need, but if you're thinking 10 years, and of course, sometimes the volunteers who are supporting those kids evolve, but the point is, we all have needs. We all are vulnerable in some ways. And you hear stories about people who had drinking problems or had family problems, and hear this relationship with these ninth graders over many years completely changed their lives. So I think the best way to think about this idea of helping is that thriving neighborhoods are not just bonding internally, they're bonding and bridging. And so some of that is doing things bridging that helps that neighborhood. Some of it can be bridging to other neighborhoods to enrich the lives of both. To support, I have the example of the organization Detroit organized loads of volunteers to help uplift neighborhoods, beautify, help with boilers and roofs, eventually help renovate schools, eventually build a hub in the neighborhood that would help uplift the whole neighborhood. So those two examples are all about people coming together, not always in a formal neighborhood dynamic, but about organizing people through some sort of bridging mechanism to uplift neighborhoods that are not their own.
Now, is it more difficult to do this kind of thing? And I think I appreciate, I recall a chapter where you talk about a place in Appalachia, but like,
Appalachia, yes.
is it more difficult to do this kind of stuff in neighborhoods that are more dispersed population wise?
Yeah, I would say rural areas are not often part of conversations when we talk about this. When I say neighborhoods, I, for the most part, mean cities and suburbs where they're very defined neighborhoods. But when we talk about rural areas, we're talking often at a county or at least at a school district level because a county could have multiple school districts. But I think it's the same idea as that you have a place and you have a set of institutions around this place, and you have to take into special characteristics. Rural areas have a special challenges because, again, what makes for thriving? Institutional abundance. When you're in a rural area, in Appalachia in particular, per capita investment and local business generation, very low. Philanthropy per capita, very low. So you may go to some of these more isolated places. There's the county seat, there's a couple of churches, and there may be no more institutions that exist in these places. So how do you? I mean, people may know their neighbors, but it's the kind of work is really hard because you got to find ways to bring people together. I mean, Appalachia has very good highways. I mean, partly because of federal money, so you can't drive places, but there are certainly greater challenges when the density of people is harder. I mean, I do think if you're in a relatively thriving farming community, which everybody has a farm, that creates some sort of positive dynamic. But you're going to a lot of rural areas where most people are not farmers, and in Appalachia, most people were working in the coal mines, and the mines have closed. And this has been economic devastation. And then there's been the opioids, and you have just wave of awful things happening. And this place will recover, but it's a great challenge. A lot of people have moved out. Money for things like schools are down, and there's not great economic opportunity, not a lot of philanthropy. So there's a lot of things that need to be done in these places.
Yeah, and I guess that's why maybe like religion becomes such a powerful force, is because that might be the only institution that's really still present and
I
active.
can't say. The question is, you say religion is a powerful force. I would say it's wrong to necessarily correlate people's beliefs with what I've described. I mean,
Hmm.
I know very powerful places to worship that are in the middle of cities.
Right.
So I don't think that's I'm not sure I would go there. I think there's a prejudice that because you live in rural areas somehow I guess you're more religious or something. So I would have to look at the data on that.
Right.
I do think that it's likely that religion plays a larger role in people's lives because it's people are people change is not coming as fast to these places,
Hmm.
and people gather more likely to be gathered in religious places. But I would not necessarily say that those are the places that are the only places where I find real. I mean, I can certainly find them in lots of cities. I mean, I think in the United States, you find faith not necessarily urban versus rural. You find it very much geography is very
Hmm.
much the case. I would have to look in the data to see. I mean, I've certainly seen enormously successful churches also in cities.
Hmm.
So I do think I'm not sure I would necessarily say that they're being shaped. You could also say maybe the churches are being shaped by the people and the culture and the
Hmm.
surrounding environment as well. I think you could also argue that as well.
Interesting. Okay. Um, I guess in your worldly travels, was there a particular? Can you name a country or a city or somewhere you visited that kind of like surprised you in terms of like how strong neighborhood their neighborhoods were?
I mean, I would say I've been in general. I mean, one of the reasons why I love to work on fragile states. I mean, they're
Hmm.
very hard to make peace in these places.
Hmm.
But I would just say that the people are warm,
Hmm.
local communities are strong. So I could go the Middle East. I
Hmm.
go in Africa. You can find. I'm less familiar with Latin America, and of course, I lived in Asia for many years. But I would say particularly in like the Middle East and in Africa, you have lots and lots of strong local community.
Hmm.
I mean, the richness of relationships is something that's really hard for us to imagine in the United States. I mean, I've seen people make sacrifices for their community, for their family, for their place in a way that we would find very hard to imagine. I certainly could give specific examples if you wanted it.
Hmm. Sure. I mean, if there's
I
anything.
mean, I can think of places, for example, in Nigeria. You make some money, immediately sending money to your town to, I mean, maybe for the school, for the generator. I mean, today, many more people have electricity, but I remember when I first traveled in these places, the only way they had a generator is because some benefactor from the neighborhood or from that town uh, gave money for the place.
Hmm.
And so I would just say that I mean, you can see this. I write about it in the book. I have a friend who's Kurdish. So this is not quite a neighborhood as much as a small statelet in the northwest Syria, and very committed to her place and her people in essence. And her father passed away, I believe, in Spain, and she literally took this person through. I mean, to take a body back to the homeland was taking the body through security checkpoints in a country that's still in a semi state of war to bring him back and take the risk. I mean, she does this as part of her job to some extent, but to take a body and go through everything, that was quite a lot of work to make sure he was buried back home. And
Wow.
so, I mean, this is about people having a loyalty to place. This is people. I mean, you see in America today, there's. I think it's more true post COVID. You see a small number of people who saying, "I'm going to move back to the town near where my family is." In small town, there's even an organization, Lead for America, trying to encourage college graduates from small towns to not do what's been done for the last 50 years, is have a brain drain from the center of America and from small town America to big cities. You know, everyone goes to college and they never go home, and we encourage people to leave their place. Today you have a whole organization, Lead for America, and I know many of those people, to bring people, encourage people to go back, get prominent roles, and to be leaders. You know, you could be 25 and you could be a prominent person in a town of 10,000 people in a way you never could be in a city of a few million.
Yeah.
So it gives you a completely different role at an earlier part of your life. And so there's organizations that do this. And I certainly have seen it around the world, people sending remittances home, people buying a house there. So at least they have a connection. They go back and forth. I mean, you see lots of. I mean, it's a huge amount of money. We talk about foreign aid, but actually, more than foreign aid is the money that people send back to their hometowns, often to their families,
Hmm.
but it also has an enormous impact on the economies. Often, there might be their brother or their cousin starting small businesses or expanding the farm where they live because one person's in the United States earning money and sending an extra 100, 200, $300 home. We don't realize the scale of this, but it's all over the world. So I would just say I find a lot of people warm. I find a lot of people very well connected, and I do think this is something that's not appreciated, not even noticed for the most part.
Yeah. Well, and you know, and I think about like it feels like my daughter's a senior in high school this year, so we go to these colleges, and I remember when I was looking at colleges, there seems to be almost like this in the higher education, this kind of movement towards bigger and global or national, and I feel like there. I don't know if there's something else that could be done there, but I think I wish there was more of an orientation towards picking up skills or education or connections or resources or whatever to be able to go back and serve your community versus like taking the trajectory that has you become the CEO of a multinational company or consultant or lawyer
Yes.
or
Well, I
investment
would
banker.
recommend Lead for America is the most
That's
obvious. I mean,
yeah,
they're in hundreds of places. I don't know what it means about if you're coming from a neighborhood in Brooklyn, but
right.
in terms of small towns in Middle America, I mean, they're huge.
Yeah.
They're incredible what they've been doing.
That's great. Are there chapters on colleges, or is it more
I mean,
something that?
literally, it's. I believe their model is they reach out to people at top universities
Okay.
and they establish programs. They work with AmeriCorps and they have fellowships in towns. And I know people in Kansas and Minnesota and all places like that who are Lead for America fellows. And they're basically, it opens up a whole new universe, a whole new direction for them
Yeah.
that they would not have otherwise. And again, if you look at the data, and I know this data, about 10 states collect the best people from the other 40 states. And that's the way it's been for 50 years. And it wasn't that way before then.
Yeah. That's. I mean, it's. I guess it's encouraging that there's been that realization and that there's something, some organization really trying to
I mean,
redirect.
the internet and the technology, which has been mostly drawing people out, also provides a way for them to live in these places, but still participate in national conversations, to access, I guess, the movies or some of the other things they want. It's not the same as walking into a museum, but you're able to access art and culture and things that you normally could not, or historically, you
Yeah.
could not access from a small town. So, something about the technology today, and I think if we have a greater appreciation of the importance of being home,
Hmm.
being near family, investing in a place, playing a leadership role in place, more and more people will step up to do that.
Yeah, that's great, and I like how you you bring in the technology as a good thing in this respect because it's easy to think about the bad things, but that's a benefit of the technology is
That's
that
a benefit. I
connectivity.
mean, I think
Yeah.
we have to think much harder about. I think this is one of the questions, and I know people are thinking about this: is how do we use technology to encourage embodied or in-person relationships? I mean, I know there's several people working on what you might call neighborhood apps
Hmm.
that will help people connect where they are, find help for things they need, organize activities, celebrate their neighborhoods, and so I think
Yeah.
that's a great direction. And excuse me, and I think too much technology is driving us apart.
Yeah.
We need to creative ways for technology to bring us together.
You meant to me what I feel like there should be is I think a lot of the reasons why sometimes you'll buy things online is just because you want to like get it out of your mind, and I wish there was a thing where like you could set reminders so that I need to get a key made or something, and it will remind you when you walk past one of those stores or drive past one of those stores, but in the city walk past one of them where like, it pings you to go to the local merchant or I want to get a book or I need to get this to that so you can support local businesses. Because I think one of the things that I'm taking away from our conversation is that there's the nationalization of things is something that I think we should pull back from a bit. And in one respect, I think just spending money and going to local merchants is one way of many that you can kind of support your neighborhood. And I think
I mean, I
Thomas,
would say that. I mean, I think at the policy level, state and local authorities should be looking for ways to encourage, to some extent, we could talk about local wealth creation, but also it's about creating institutions that enable like local home ownership, local
mhm,
businesses to start, local like third places, stops, shops, everything. If government was structured that gave more power to the neighborhoods,
mhm,
again, there's a balance as we discussed before, but to the extent that people can join together and have civic associations and other things. I mean, even schools, I know people talk a lot, we talk about schools in a very practical manner. What about schools as incubators of relationships? If kids walk to school,
yeah,
I wrote recently about mini libraries. What would happen if instead of libraries just being about access to knowledge, libraries shrunk and were embedded more in neighborhoods, not just those things that people have in front of houses, but a place to meet, a place to gather people. It was much more than just knowledge is everywhere today. Relationships were more lacking. So, again,
yeah,
how would you think about all these institutions and also think about all of what we do individually in terms of meeting people, in terms of where we spend our time? Don't send a check to a big I mean, some of these national stuff are important. I also think politics are important. But if we think about how we could spend our time, how we could spend our money, what would happen if we volunteered for something locally, gave money locally, tried to play a leadership role in an actual organization locally? And that is where I think we will have more benefits for ourselves. We'll see a
mhm.
bigger impact, and our whole country would be better for those choices.
That's wonderful. A great way to kind of summarize everything as we hit the 1 hour mark. Um, I'd like to. I guess we should probably wrap up here because I'm sure you have other things to do. Can I ask, like, what gives you hope at the end of the day?
I think the thing that's been most hopeful about this journey is the people I meet. So many people want to step up and do more. And I think they're just looking for ways to do more. And I think the more we are able to give them, I mean, again, we are a country with a long history of everybody stepping up and playing a role in supporting each other, leadership role, doing things in your neighborhood or in your town or in your city to help make it better and help the people around you. The more we're able to generate those opportunities, the more hopeful, the more people will feel empowered, and they'll feel like they're taking their country back. And I'm hopeful because I see loads of people doing stuff or wanting to do stuff. And I think the big question is only how do we catalyze it, encourage, give opportunity for that.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having this conversation and connecting. It was a bit of a random email to you, and I really
No,
thrilled that
it's
you
it's my
responded.
great pleasure. Are we stopped recording?
Not yet. No.
Oh, got it. Okay, no, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I was going to say something afterwards, but thank
Okay.
you.
And when if folks want to follow what you're doing, are you on in social media, website, stuff like that?
Well, by all means, you can find my website, sethkaplan.org. You can find me on LinkedIn. Again, Seth Kaplan on LinkedIn. Again, if you people read the book and they have questions or they want to know more about anything, by all means, find me either through the website or through LinkedIn. It's my great pleasure. And again, thank you so much, Michael, for organizing this.
Well, thank you. And here's the book again, Fragile Neighborhoods by Seth D. Kaplan. Check it out. And thank you to all the listeners and viewers out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Thanks so much, Seth.
Thank you so much.